Good morning. Many years ago I was a youth group leader. There were 4 of us leading this youth group, a nice group, a bunch of kids, 20, 25, mainly church kids, early teens and their friends. There were 4 of us leading it, all in our early 20s and one a married couple. It was fairly easy and fun. Then one night we were engaged in our youth group activities when we heard this noise out on the street from the footpath, shouting and carrying on, and it sounded like some guys. So Dave, the other leader, the other guy, and I went out to find out what was going on, and there was this group, half a dozen young blokes, a bit older than our youth group kids, mid-teens, all boys. And they're making all sorts of comments and funny sort of abusive comments and yelling out. We asked them, we said hello and asked them, were they all right? Did they need anything? What was going on? And they laughed and carried on. And I guess they were worried they were going to get in trouble. I don't know. But anyway, they kept going. And it turned out that one of their brothers was a member of the youth group. He joined the youth group because he liked one of the girls. He was a bit younger. And they were giving him a hard time. They were bored. They were kids who roamed the streets on a Friday or Saturday night, did their own thing, harassed shopkeepers or whatever, sat in the park, and I suppose at times if they could get any grog they'd even drink that. Anyway, we invited them in because they didn't want to come in, and off they went. The next week they were back, and the week after, they kept coming back. And Dave and I kept going out, and gradually the conversations were getting longer and longer, and that was okay. The other leaders were fine with the youth group. And we started hearing more and more of their stories, and then a few times we went out and said, look, let's go for a walk with you. You know, what do you do? Take us where you normally go. And they showed us around the streets where they walked. I mean, streets we knew in the daylight, but usually not at night. The lanes and around the shops, and the shopkeepers they tried to harass, and we tried to keep a lid on that a bit. The parks where they'd sat. And as we went, we saw something into their world and heard their stories of life and struggle. Stories of darkness and pain and suffering in some of their lives, abuse that young people shouldn't have to experience, and I in my whole life have not had to endure. They took us into their world and trusted us, and at points it was a dark world and difficult world. These young blokes were struggling to find their way in life and what it meant. We kept inviting them into the youth group if they'd like to come in and be part of it, but they kept putting us off and off. But gradually that got less and less, and they said, not this week. Eventually they joined in, they came in. And that was exciting for us, but also really challenging. I mean, they brought their own set of challenges and questions and the differences. They were a bit older, they were blokes, they didn't know their way in a church, and they were different, culturally different. And there was a bit of conflict and tension, and tension with the church people that often came and went. We'd gone into their world and experienced something of their life that was very different, and they came into our world and experienced something that was very different to them. We eventually found a neutral ground where the couple had a townhouse. Dave and Carol had a townhouse, and they were very mission-minded, and invited and welcomed those young blokes into their home when they needed to talk. They had a regular gathering. I mean, they might have called it a Bible study. It was really a conversation, chatting. You know, tell us your story, sharing stories, and sharing something of God's love and grace as appropriate. And that place became that neutral venue where it wasn't our world in the church, so to speak, and it wasn't their world in the streets. It was a place where the stories could be shared. And we learned from each other. And there was growth, and there was change and transformation. Those young blokes taught me about the world, about the other. If I'd come across these blokes walking down the street at night, you know, some of them were getting big, or older blokes, I'd have turned and walked away. I'd have avoided them. They looked threatening, and their language and their voices being loud and were threatening. I'd have considered them dangerous. And they may have been dangerous as they got older. They helped me to see the other. That when I looked into their faces, I no longer saw threatening young boys yelling out abusive comments on this footpath, but young men who were vulnerable, who were trying to find their way in the world and were lost, who needed a lot of support and help and mentors and didn't have that in homes often. People who needed some guidance and way in their lives. They showed me that they were human beings, vulnerable and struggling just like me, seeking their own way in the world, to become the person that they were created to be. And they and so many other different people in different groups and at different times have shown me the diversity of life and people, have welcomed me into places that I would not have gone to, have helped me to see beyond the barriers and fences that were around me and my life and my culture and my way. Language, culture, different faiths, different lifestyles, different ways of being and living and different experiences. People who lived with mental health issues, who were creative and loving people, but sometimes encumbered by the demons of the mind, schizophrenia, bipolar or depression. Those who live with intellectual disabilities or severe autism, and show me the beauty of life and who they were in the beauty of their being. Loving people, young people in particular, we met and worked with. People who are in deep pain and suffering through illness or death or grief, or those who are impoverished. Or the stories of Indigenous people who came and shared their vulnerability, who were struggling with their place in the world, holding their culture and the beauty and the value of their culture and the stories of their family and ancestors, but no longer having access to the land that their ancestors lived on and worked with and told stories about, who looked at that land and saw that it was being destroyed and changed. They had no power. Or those who had been taken as young people, stolen generation so-called, removed from their homes because of their dark skin and placed with white families. Or people who are refugees seeking asylum, who have come from lands that persecuted them and oppressed them, whose lives are in danger, or who are escaping war or famine or whatever it was and seeking refuge, but had been caught up in the legalities and the structures and the processes that kept them tied down. These and so many other people have helped me to see the other, the person who is different, the person behind the different colour skin, the different language, the different belief system, the different way of life, the different experience, that they too are a child of God, vulnerable, broken and needing love and inclusion and community just like me. And I think Matthew's story of Jesus is helping his little community at the end of the first century to deal with what it means to live as God's people in this difficult world. A world where Roman emperors oppressed the Christians and the scattered Christian communities, the diverse Christian communities. A world where the Jewish authorities gradually were pushing them away and there was conflict and tension. And what it means to live in this way of Jesus, this inclusive, loving way of Jesus in a world that's difficult and threatening. I read his story and see how he's pushing his little community out to be brave and courageous, to share love in the world that needs love in this way of Jesus that's inclusive, that's about justice and peace and reconciliation, of embracing people in all their diversity, of lifting up those who are squashed down and pushed down and marginalised and bringing them in to include them so there's a seat at the table for everyone and everyone shares the same food. I see his story. And this week, Jesus is talking with his disciples. The Pharisees and religious leaders have opposed him. And the disciples are saying, reporting back what they're saying. And Jesus says to them, look, those religious people, they hang on to their laws, their purity laws, and they control them. And they talk about, you don't wash your hands properly in the right ritual way before you eat. And he says it's not what goes into the mouth that makes people unclean. It's what comes out of the heart and the being, out of your mouths, your actions and your words. The rituals that he's talking about, the washing hands, it's not about disease and germs and infection. It's about religious purity. You may have touched something that's unclean, bodily fluids or people or things that are unclean, and that would make the food you ingest unclean, that would make your body unclean. And he says that's nonsense. It's what comes out of a person. It's what's in their heart and their being that's expressed in their life, in their words and actions and attitudes. It's like what Martin Luther King Jr. says. That he dreams of his children, his 4 children, being judged not by the colour of their skin, but the quality of their character. What comes out of them, not the superficial things. And Jesus has these run-ins with religious people who want to control the way people live and think and be. The rules and regulations are easy to control and manipulate. But he invites people into an inclusive way of love and justice. And then there's a story that's really quite profound and challenging. And Jesus himself is confronted and challenged when he goes into a Gentile territory of Tyre and Sidon, just outside the regions of Israel. And this woman, in Matthew's story, she's called a Canaanite. In Mark's, it's a Syrophoenician. She's a Gentile, a pagan. But in Matthew's, speaking to Jewish Christians, he takes them back to the early stories. This is a Canaanite. This is one of the original inhabitants. The enemies, our traditional enemies. This is the other in every way. And she comes and she breaks the taboos, treads all over the rules. She, a woman of another faith and culture, comes and addresses a man who is a Jew, a rabbi. It's not done. She throws herself at his feet and begs mercy for her daughter who is sick. Help my daughter. And he says, I've come to help the children of Israel. Who are you? Please help me. And he says, the most incredible thing, he says, why take the food, the bread of the children, the Israelite people, the Jewish people, and feed it to the dogs? You, the pagans, the Gentiles. Why give the food that is the children's, the Jews, to the pagans? And instead of being taken aback or offended or angered, she says, yeah, but even the dogs get to eat the leftovers, the scraps, the crumbs that drop from the children's table. I just want some of the crumbs, the leftovers, for my daughter. You can do that. And Jesus looks at her amazed and says, wow, go in peace, woman, your faith is great. Your daughter is well. Jesus is challenged and confronted by this woman, and I think Matthew is using this story to challenge his community, to push them out. The other that you see, that the differences you see out there are actually not that important. And those people who are different that you see, God loves. They're children of God. And Matthew is helping his community to go out, to look outwards to the world, to take this message and this way, this life of love and inclusion and generosity, this generosity of God into the world to all people. And we're invited to be part of that. To share our food, our lives, our love, our hope, this love of God with the world. And that is the hope for the world. The hope for our families, our churches, our communities, our nations, our world. That we will reach out and overcome the barriers, break down the barriers of difference and diversity, and see that our difference is not a problem, but it adds colour and life to our lives. Will you join Jesus on this journey of bringing love and hope and life to our world? Amen.